I feel like there's no other entry point to this interview other than, how this record came to be, obviously. Sort of feel like I'd be asking Shakespeare to give me one of his sonnets in a nutshell, but I think that's essentially what I'm about to do here, because you wrote this amazing whole thing on the piece on your trials to get to this record on, what is it, Talkhouse? Is that the website?
Yeah.
And I think I've passed that around to everyone I know, whether they know your music or not, because it was just such an amazing story. But I guess let's start from there. I mean, if you could tell me the story, because it's just heartbreaking and amazing.
Oh, well, I'm often compared to Shakespeare. We'll start there.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So I started making a record like people often do, sort of loosely informed or inspired by a particular set of challenges, which for me was an illness, which had been kind of undiagnosed for a long time. It caused me to get progressively sicker and sicker and skinnier, and took me off the road. It took me basically just kind of out of my job, out of the thing I've done my whole life, and those were kind of the easiest parts of what it did. It robbed me of kind of like life for a little while. So I was diagnosed with an illness called C. Diff, which is like an intestinal, infection, I guess, and it's potentially fatal. Often is fatal. So luckily, thankfully, thanks to some people at Music Cares, which is a wonderful organization that helps musicians get diagnoses, helps them get treatment for addiction, for anything, illness. Anyway, I got a diagnosis, and I spent the next year recovering from this illness and writing a record that wasn't really about gastric distress, but was about sort of loss and missing things in life that have felt really normal to you, or innate. And I went to make it with my friend Rob Schnaff, who had shown interest in working with me on a record. And I got really sick again right before I went in, and lost like 40 pounds again real quick. The doctors didn't know what was going on. Yeah, just like weight just kind of tumbled off very, very fast. I mean, I keep saying it felt like overnight, but it really did feel like overnight. Yeah. So I was hospitalized a couple times. I was still free of this illness, so they weren't sure what was happening. And I just went anyway. We thought about canceling it, but just, I can't really explain why I went. But I went, and we basically made this record, and then couldn't sing it because just the nature of my stomach illness was just almost impossible to talk, let alone sing. So on the advice of some doctors, I flew back to Indiana with basically a full record done, just feeling like I need to duck back out there and sing it at some point when my situation stabilized, assuming that it would. And and then I got home, and this other kind of mess happened, which was a marriage broke up. And, on account of that, I sort of was set adrift. I was bouncing around houses that weren't mine and basements, and I underwent a surgery and a few procedures like that during this period, and basically rewrote the record, and had to try to find ways to raise the money and stuff while I was essentially homeless. And
I mean, this is like the ultimate storm of everything, because I mean,
it sounds like a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, artists use pain for albums all the time, but this is something on a completely different level, like what you've had to go through for this. Although I've even heard you say that you're, in a odd way, almost grateful.
I am for some of it. I mean, I'll say that I wish it would chill out. The worst part about it is this anticipation of getting sick, because every year or two I seem to have one of these episodes since I had this illness where I lose a lot of weight again. So, yeah, I am grateful for it to some degree, because it's made me a better person in certain ways. I've had insights into parts of life that I do think most people don't get until later in life, maybe. That said, at the time it felt somehow, even saying it out loud, it sounds like a lot, but there's no way for me to explain how much of a lot it was. I mean, it was the first time in my life where I really felt like, not to be dramatic, but like I might not get through this thing, Mm-hmm. I mean, I felt I was just so sick, and when you're that sick and you have like a marriage or whatever, the best way I can describe it is just like it's so surreal that I'd have to be a much smarter person and more articulate to put any words to how surreal it felt. To be dealing with it.
I mean, it sounds like, especially if you're still having to deal with this, on a semi-consistent basis, because I was thinking of, when you go through any kind of traumatic episode that, once you have it in hindsight, that time has a way of smoothing it all out. But you've got this album that is a complete testament to everything that you've felt. during that time. So have you, I don't know, do you get to escape those moments at all?
Yes and no. I don't know. There's more like personally, I think I'm still in that phase where like a lot of stuff has calmed down and smoothed out, like you said, but I think it takes more years than this to escape it from an emotional standpoint. The record, yeah, there's moments where like playing those songs live or hearing them is tough and feels overwhelming. But there's also moments where like my kind of pride kicks in, I guess, and I'm just like amazed that it got made, I guess, and that maybe is more of a feeling that I'm harboring than some hang up on the emotional heft of what's in it, I guess.
There is a part in the whole story, I guess it's when you finally get to surgery, as you say, the doctors saw it into your abdomen, and it really does seem like, I don't know, the way I read it was like that was the cork in the bottle right there, you know, that was the plug in the drain, and once that was out of the way, like all of these stuff just starts rushing through you. Was that the big turnaround moment for you when this album really does end up in the way it is now?
It seems like, yeah. And I don't know. So I had the surgery and I was living in a basement and recovering from surgery in a way that was really not optimal, to say the least. And I was like prescribed these painkillers that I didn't take for the first couple of days, just because I don't know if I can avoid that kind of stuff, I do, just because. But finally, I was in so much pain that I took them, and it was that week, in this basement recovering from the surgery, where I wrote a big chunk of these songs that became the new record. So yeah, I don't know if it was the surgery per se, but it did. I mean, there was a certain point where you've slipped on a bunch of banana peels in the silent comedy, and then like the piano falls on your head. And it's just like, it feels comical almost because of how much overkill. And I do remember sitting, in the hospital, getting ready for the surgery and then putting the mask on me to put me under and having this really intense, like, comedic response. Like, this is hilarious. Like, I don't know. It was terrible, but there was points in it where, I don't know, the surgery changed my point of view a little bit. It just felt like, well, at a certain point, you just like, yeah, the piano's falling on your head. There's nothing to do but just like giggle and give in to some degree.
I'll actually repurpose something real quick. You wrote about Father John Misty's new record too, Pure Comedy. It seems like that it gets to a point where those two words start to make a whole different bit of context in your own life.
Yeah, well, I think he probably processes it from a place of humor a little quicker than I do, but. Yeah, I don't know. It was definitely the impetus to writing again, and it wasn't something like I thought about. I didn't in no way wanted to re-record an album or rewrite an album. As you can imagine, it's just incredibly expensive, and I self-fund a lot of these things these days. So, yeah, it was not part of the grand scheme plan.
To get songs this personal from anyone and to have that backstory to go with it. I mean, and then you hear lines like in Rollin', 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 when you're saying, asking God to make you strong. It's like you think about when songwriters are writing songs and they talk about being universal, and then you have others that are just so specific that you can't not relate to it, even though it's such a specific moment. And I feel like that's one of those moments, like I didn't go through there, but somehow I'm part of every word that you're doing.
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, I hope, sometimes I make these things and I feel like there is a level of like, it's so sad or heavy or whatever that doesn't have any of that, but I hope that there's some uplift in it, and I hope there's some comedy and all this stuff. I mean, I really never go into it trying to batter people over the head with bummer, I think there's all sorts of stuff. There's lots of hope in there, and I think some of it is funny, I mean, it's like Dr. Strangelove or something, he can like, Kubrick or someone can sit for a year or 2 years trying to make this story about nuclear annihilation, and they realize that the only way it works is a comedy because it's so absurd and it's so over the top. So maybe I should have made it even funnier. I don't know.
It was actually, thinking with all of that, I mean, I'm sure you have a really solid point of view on the the entire healthcare debate and everything that comes from that outside of the record.
I sure do. Well, yeah, I mean, that could be a whole thing. I will say that anyone that's cursed to go through one of these sort of things really finds out quickly how screwed up the whole thing is, and not just from the insurance side. I went to see doctors for half a decade who, for the most part, just kind of told me to like I mean, I think I put it in the piece, but this is really literally told me to try eating yogurt. Yeah, it's a kind of a mess. You really realize, unfortunately, how, when you're a kid or even young adult, it's this weird thing, like anytime something on your body hurts, there's going to be someone who can fix it. And you realize, it's a really rough thing to realize that, like, no, they know so little, really, about what's going on ever. So there's another bit of clarity for this interview.
I don't know where the line is to cross here, but I'd be curious if your ex-wife has heard this record.
Well, I think so, yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think maybe there was some resistance to that initially that gave way to morbid curiosity.
Yeah, and that's all of us, looking at the car crash, I guess.
Yeah, she loves it. She thinks she's bought several copies of it.
Regardless of all of that, I mean, like I said, it's a beautiful record, and it's you were talking about adding it all in, and I guess that's my takeaway from it. It's a very human record because it is all of the emotions, in there. It's not a black and white thing, and I guess that's what makes it great.
That's the best thing I could hear about it. Yeah, well, thanks a lot. Yeah.
It's a pleasure talking to you, and if you're ever down this way in Louisville, you're so close. We'd love to have you around sometime. Make sure you stop by.
That sounds great. Thanks a lot.
All right, Rich. Take care.
All right. Thank you. You too.
Bye.
Bye.